to see that?
Yes, it should be okay now. I just did that.
Okay.
Monica, can you confirm you're fine?
Hi, yes, I just got the API token. I'm inserting it now.
All right, thank you. Also,
Thank you.
I believe we're about to start, and I just wanted to welcome everyone, both the panelists and attendees, to this webinar. Just so you know, this call is being recorded under the IGF Code of Conduct, and for attendees, if you wanna say something, you can. If you have a question, you can use the Q&A, or you can just post it in the chat. If you want to take the floor, you can still request, and one of the panelists or I will allow you to speak. I'm Norman again from IGF. Thank you again. Enjoy the session.
Thank you, Norman. I appreciate that. It's now 8:40 my time in Washington, D.C. We're going to hold on for just a couple more minutes to let some people trickle in as they enter the Zoom webinar using the IGF function. And we're going to get started in just a couple of minutes on this session on internet governance and news media in a time of crisis. So we're very pleased to see you all here, and we're looking forward to a really engaging discussion. So hold on, just hang tight for just a minute as we let those people filter in. As Michael mentioned just a couple minutes ago, we do want this to be a relatively engaging session. We are somewhat limited by the webinar Zoom format that we are using. And so we encourage attendees to use the Q&A function, use the chat function if that's available to you. We'll have a number of presenters, and we assume that you may have some questions. So please be very active. We've allotted a lot of time for engagement with our attendees. And so we hope to learn from our presenters, but also from our attendees. Okay, I think we will go ahead and get started. First of all, welcome. Welcome to the session on the Dynamic Coalition on the Sustainability of Journalism and News Media. This is our 2020 session at Internet Governance and News Media Sustainability in a Time of Crisis. My name is Dan O'Malley. I'm the Deputy Editor and Digital Policy Specialist at the Center for International Media Assistance. I'm one of the co-coordinators of this dynamic coalition, along with Courtney Ratch, the Advocacy Director at the Committee to Protect Journalists, and Hesbon Hansen-Awila, the Research Associate at the Innovation Center at Aga Khan University in Nairobi. Now, we're really pleased to have you join us today. We have a really stellar lineup of speakers who have contributed to this year's annual report. Our annual report is our knowledge input to the IGF. And in just a couple of minutes, they're going to be briefly sharing some of their findings from the research and analysis on this topic of media sustainability that they've done over the past year. First, I just want to talk a little bit about the history of our dynamic coalition. The coalition was officially recognized by the IGF last year in 2019. The objective was to serve as a platform for stakeholders, diverse stakeholders from across the internet governance system, to engage around issues of media sustainability, which we mean both in the economic terms as well as in the broader forces that uphold independent journalism in society. And it was born out of a recognition that, virtually all elements of the production and dissemination of journalism and news are impacted by internet governance decisions in some way. This includes issues from content moderation to data governance, to algorithmic policies, revenue sharing and the digital economy. The list goes on. Yet all too often, these types of impacts on the news ecosystem are not necessarily fully taken into account by other internet governance stakeholders. And so we wanted to create a space where that could happen. Traditionally, news ecosystems have been managed and regulated at the national level. But now the predominance of the internet as a digital platform, a global one, means that decisions being made in Silicon Valley by private corporations are having enormous impacts in countries around the world. And I'm sure we've all read some of the tragic horror stories, comes to mind the situation in Myanmar. So our news media ecosystem has been really, in different countries, has been really impacted by these global internet governance decisions. And it's something that this dynamic coalition seeks to shed a spotlight on. Now, back in 2019, when this dynamic coalition was formed, the issue of media sustainability was already a very pressing one, very concerning one. But then in 2020, as I don't have to remind you, the pandemic hit, and that added urgency to this issue. The economic downturn meant that many independent media were struggling just to survive. Some have called it a potential extinction event for independent media and journalism. However, at the same time, citizen demand for news and information increased significantly. The need for this independent reporting went up. And anecdotally, we've also heard that, alongside this demand, traffic to news websites has also gone up. So this is a kind of a very challenging time on a number of different fronts. It's a very precarious situation for news media and journalism in general. But I think that there are potentially opportunities coming out of this as well. In all likelihood, one thing that we'll see going out is that there will be a larger reliance on digital platforms for the circulation of news, information, economic forces, etc. And so I think that means that the work of this dynamic coalition is actually likely to grow in importance. And so I think it's a good thing that we've got this started and we can continue to grow. I'm going to explain just a little bit about how we're going to run today's session. And that is, we are going to be launching an annual report, which will go live later today. But today we're going to have presentations by all of the contributors of this annual report. And my co-coordinator, Courtney Ratch, is going to be leading that discussion, which we hope to be really fruitful. And then that will be followed by an open discussion and question and answer with all the panelists. That's going to be the primary thing that we'll be doing today. Before we move to that, though, I'd like to give Henriette Esther-Hewson, who's the chair of the MAG right now, she's willing and able to give a couple remarks. She was very generous to our group in writing a preface for our annual report, which we're very excited to share later on. Henriette, are you there? I believe.
Dan, she might have already left.
She might have already left. Okay.
Was
well,
here.
Apologies. She's first of all, she's a very busy woman, so we were very lucky just to have her in here for a fleeting moment. But I just want to, once we release this, I really encourage you to read that. Henriette doesn't need an introduction, but as the former executive director of the Association for Progressive Communication and now the chairwoman of the MAG, she's an incredibly influential person in the space and is deeply committed to overall media development. So we were really pleased to have her contribution to this report. Without further ado, I'm now going to pass the baton over to Courtney Ratch, who's going to discuss our annual report and lead us through a moderated discussion with our contributors.
Great. Thanks so much, Dan, for that introduction. And thanks to everyone who's joining us today for this discussion. We are definitely disappointed not to have Henriette, but I do want to talk just briefly as we get into this discussion. A couple of the three main points that are addressed in this report that the Dynamic Coalition focused on this year, which is, the fact that the access to high quality news and information is a fundamental component to all development goals. And I think that one of the things that the creation of this dynamic coalition really emphasizes, and we're going to get into the specifics of that as you'll see in the following discussion. Also, that the technical and policy decisions that are being made by tech companies and governments treat the impact on the news media ecosystem as an afterthought, rather than thinking about how those decisions will ripple through our information ecosystem and cross borders. And finally, that the IGF is a critical venue for discussions on media sustainability because of its global, multidisciplinary, and multi-stakeholder scope. So without further ado, we are going to kind of take a view of some of these issues at the intersection of internet governance and media sustainability by looking at some specific case samples and case studies, and then widening out to kind of some of the broader systemic issues. So with that, I'd like to invite our first contributor who wrote for Burn from Serbia about the impact of how algorithmic removal of news content in Serbia is having an impact there. So Tanya, I'm going to ask for you to kick us off.
Well, hello everyone. Nice to be here even in this virtual space. It's always a pleasure to participate in IGF. So I wanted to thank you all for the opportunity to contribute to the Dynamic Coalition report, and I just wanted to make a couple key points about the algorithmic removal of the content in Serbia, which I think could be very easily transferred to the Balkan countries and to the countries of global south, because I feel that problems that we are facing are somewhat similar. So basically what I wanted to raise as an issue at this forum is actually how can we preserve the news content, public importance reporting, investigative reporting, in a situation where digital environment is hampering us in a way, and the situation on the ground in our countries is not shiny as well. So you can all imagine that we are working in a quite hostile environment, in media systems that are quite captured by authoritarian or as we call it, illiberal governance systems. And the only way basically to bypass the limitations of these systems is to be heavily engaged on internet, heavily engaged on social media platforms. That means that we need to basically learn and obey the rules that social media platforms are posing on us, and that we have to go along with the algorithms and content curation that is posed by social media platforms. And as you will see from some of the examples that I'm going to present now, that is not always going in hand with public interest and public informing, but goes more into the monetization systems. So basically, in the period between 2014 and 2020, our monitoring efforts actually mapped 23 cases of algorithmic removal of the content in Serbia, which is fortunately not much, but these cases are quite pivotal in their essence. So we are talking about 23 cases of removal of the content coming from independent media outlets, coming from social activists, coming from artists, human rights activists. Among those 23 cases, you will hardly find cases of content that are related to hate speech or spreading of disinformation. But more often you will find cases that are, for example, critical toward governments or some of their moves. So you will see that this is actually the part of the society that is prone to undue reporting and prone to content removal. In these 23 cases, as far as the media goes and their sustainability goes, we found two models of content removal. One is related to copyright issues. And that is sort of a content removal that is easier to handle, because in that case, social media platforms simply cancel the monetization or share the monetization with authors. In other cases, we are talking about much more sensitive issues. For example, in our case, in Serbian case, those are the issues, for example, related to Serbia-Kosovo disputes, to hate tribunal war crimes, to Roma girl raping case. So you will see all the very sensitive topics, but which are still crucially important for our social dialogue. So they are, obviously quite sensitive and quite opaque, but still quite important for social dialogue. We actually had in Bern the case of removal of our two videos, which were basically proof of close ally and close friend of Ministry of Interior bribing people in minister's name. So that video was taken down in one day from the YouTube. All the dispute mechanisms like official email, like official contact form did not work. All the emails bounced back to us. So basically we had no mechanism to dispute this decision from the YouTube. And we actually had to ask for help from our international organization partners, such as Reporters Without Borders, to help us to return the content online. And it took more than a week. And if you know the media system and how it works, 1 week is an old news. So the reach of this video was definitely smaller than it would be if it was published on the similar time as the original article was. So in the coming steps, in the coming conversations, I would actually like to see media, and especially to see media outlets coming from the small markets such as Serbian, coming from the languages that are not English. We would like to see more partnership relations with policymakers on one hand, and more partner relations with the companies running social media platforms or other companies that are actually running the algorithms. We would also like to see how the new policy framework, especially the ones that is now quite heavily debated in the EU can be transferred to the Balkan countries, and to somehow try to close this regulatory and any other gap, because as you can see, our domestic regulation doesn't have a proper answer to this case. Social media platforms as private entities, private companies don't have proper answer to these questions. So we would really like to see somehow being more on board in this conversation and being more visible as an actor in these conversations. In the long run, this is going, and as the more and more people are relying on social media as a source of news, we would really like to see how can we sustain our work and in that environment, and how can we actually expand our stories which have the public importance, which are important for social dialogue, for political dialogue in our country. How can it be more expanded through the online? So I will stop here because I don't want to take much more time, but I'm here for all the other questions if you might have.
Great, thank you so much, Tanya. I mean, I think your chapter and your presentation really illustrates, your BURN stands for, you can see it behind you, the Balkan Investigative Research Network, and the impact of political topics being removed from social media platforms, the challenges that, as you say, these smaller countries, smaller news organizations without access to the big companies they're not seen as critical markets for them, and that the impact of removal can have a detrimental impact on independent media like yours, like the others that you highlighted, and which ultimately makes it harder to cultivate an audience and drive traffic to that news outlet website, which obviously has an impact on sustainability. I would definitely encourage everyone to take a look at that chapter when it is out, because there are a series of recommendations to different stakeholders. And I think that we can get into a discussion about recommendations from that chapter and from others later in the discussion. But I want to move next to Anastasia Pack and Anna Hevglin from RNW Media, whose chapter on Facebook bias against sexual and reproductive health and rights advertisements takes a case study approach to look at the Love Matters global network, and again, looking at issues of removal and what this means for their work. So with that, let me hand it over to Anastasia and Anna.
I think actually it'll be Fiona who will be presenting on research. Sorry about that.
Sorry about that, Fiona. You'll be presenting for FNW. Please go ahead.
Yeah. If possible, I'd like to share my screen just to share the brief presentation we prepared. Oh, I'm unable to share the screen. Sorry. So I think I'll just go ahead with the presentation, like just presenting, if that's okay. So with more than 70% of the world's youth online, digital technologies play a central role in young people's access to information. Within this context, independent media and media development organizations such as RNW Media play a very crucial role in ensuring young people have access to diverse, reliable, and quality content that reflect young people's needs in relation to love, sex, relationships, as well as the hopes and ambitions they have for their societies.
Fiona, we're not seeing your screen, so I don't know.
Yeah, no,
you should be able to.
I have enabled that. You should be able to share your screen now. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Sorry about that.
Yes, wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
so going back to the presentation, just a brief understanding of what Love Matters is. The Love Matters Global Network is a part of the SRHR program of RNW Media, with member organizations in India, Mexico, Kenya, Nigeria, the DRC, Egypt, and China. So the network members are all implement the unique Love Matters model to support safe, healthy, pleasurable sex, love, and relationships for young people by building digital communities where young people can access information and discuss their sexual reproductive health in a safe online space. So young people are active on social media, this is evident, and especially when it comes to sexual and reproductive health and rights, young people aim to access this information on social media. So we focus on these online communication channels just to be able to empower and engage these young people. So unfortunately, the changing Facebook policies have significantly affected the ways in which we as an organization can reach our audience and the type of content we're able to offer them. Our ability to reach our audience organically has also really decreased in recent years, again, due to Facebook changing policies. So in order to be able to ensure wider reach for our content and to be able to engage with a diverse cohort of young people on Facebook, we rely heavily on paid advertisements and greater level of censorship on our content, even if the content is not considered to violate Facebook policies. So when it comes to content moderation, the content moderation policies often run the risk of censoring content and limiting the right to access information, especially when it comes to sensitive topics such as sexual and reproductive health and rights. So from 2015 until August 2020, we had a total of 1,792 ads from 6 Love Matters platforms rejected. Again, majority of these advertisements took place in the countries where our program is located in DRC, Egypt, and Kenya. But then again, there are also instances of advertisement rejection in Nigeria and Mexico. Facebook categorization naming system, it produces in 1 or 2 words the reason for the ad rejection. So they're never really clear as to why the ads get rejected. Majority of the reasons they give is because the content is considered as adult content. So this seems to be like a miscategorization at hand. So how it affects Love Matters platforms. It's essential to ensure that social media platforms are a safe space for freedom of expression, as we rely greatly on these platforms to educate these young people. So Love Matters Kenya, for example, we've encountered a multitude of challenges when publishing SRHR related content and many attempts trying to promote this content through ads. Last year, August 2019 to March 2020, our ads account got blocked, unfortunately. And during this period, we really had to rely on organic reach in order to be able to reach to these young people and just be able to inform them on their SRHR. Another limiting factor is the nature of our content. So unfortunately, some of this SRHR content, it can't be easily addressed on digital platforms or even modified for Facebook advertisements. I'd say this content covers roughly 80% of what we share. So we talk about making love to sex problems and even LGBTQ related content in a country that considers the topic taboo, which is pretty frustrating. And also for the rest of my team members also working on the same Love Matters digital communities. Furthermore, several studies suggest that Facebook regulations on sexual and adult content disproportionately affect women and result in censorship of marginalized population. So this varies from region to region. If you see the examples of some of the ads that got rejected, the reasons tend to vary. And also previous research on ads rejection on Love Matters platform established that ads targeted at women were rejected more frequently than those targeted towards men. But then the Love Matters social media editors also perceive this impact. It's something we've observed in our work. For this reason, we as the editors for Love Matters constantly adapt to find creative ways just to be able to try and escape the disapproval of ads and continue to be able to inform these young people on the SRHR. So for us in Kenya, we tend to use slang, which isn't easily recognized by the Facebook algorithm. As there are clear conclusions we can draw from this insight on how and when the advertisements get disapproved based on Facebook policies, that there are not really any clear conclusions as to why Facebook does this. But I would say that, first of all, there's lack of clarity around the content moderation policies, including application of the community guidelines, terms of service, and advertising policies. So Facebook should ensure that their policies are sufficiently clear and in line with international human rights standards, especially with regards to SRHR. And then secondly, there's also need for transparency around Facebook's content moderation policies regarding the application of their advertising policy. There's need for transparency on why advertisements are rejected and roles certain tools such as the algorithm play in this process. So we as the Love Matters Global Network call upon social media platforms just to ensure that the policies are human rights based, clear and transparent, and they have an effective responsive appeal system in place. Thank you for your time.
Great, thank you so much, Fiona. It seems like there are a couple of similarities here in terms of the lack of transparency about how these removals are applied, what the framework for those removals are, and certainly a lack of access to remedy and any sort of meaningful way to contest those. I think that the fact that such public interest content is being blocked by the social media platforms because they've labeled it sexual or adult in nature, but it clearly is a public interest goal. It should be something that everyone in the internet governance community should be concerned about. And the fact that, this, I think your contribution here in particular highlights the fact that there is a gendered nature to content moderation, and that can impact on the public information ecosystem. So thank you for sharing that. So I am now going to talk about the third chapter in our annual report, which is one that I wrote coming out of an article that I did for Committee to Protect Journalists called The Politics of Labels and How Tech Platforms Regulate State Media. So one of the things that this chapter looks at is how three major platforms, Facebook, Google, and Twitter, have rolled out labeling of state media or state affiliated media, state controlled media. They're all using different terminology, ostensibly as an effort to fight disinformation and propaganda, as a way to increase visibility and information for media and information literacy of their users. But what I find is that these labels, unsurprisingly, are being rolled out in an inconsistent and often less than transparent way. So over the past 2 years, YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter have all implemented new policies for the state-linked media outlets. I have a chart in this chapter, which I'm not sure I can share my screen, so I'm not going to try to do that while moderating and talking. But essentially, if you look at the way that these different platforms have taken the approach, Facebook well, let's start with Google, which rolled this out a couple of years ago on YouTube, labeling state-controlled media, state-funded media and publicly funded media. My analysis when they first rolled this out showed that it was very inconsistent in terms of not global. It was rolled out first in the United States, but then even had some impact beyond those borders. And it wasn't clear because in some cases these labels were applied to the videos themselves. But if you went into the About section for the channel, there was no information that would link why it had gotten the label, because those About Us sections are written by the outlet itself. So Google rolled this out. They decided to, make the decision based on the Wikipedia articles for most of those outlets, and then added in a component of consultation with kind of the expert community, although those people and organizations are not identified. Full disclosure, I and CPJ was included in that consultation, as I think some of the other groups on this call were as well. But one of the challenges with that is, of course, that Wikipedia is a open source group created encyclopedia, and the fact that it wasn't rolled out consistently, and that they're not collecting any data to look at how that impacts on media information literacy or on traffic to those websites. We then saw over this summer, specifically in the lead up to the US elections and as well as in the wake of the protests in Hong Kong, that both Facebook and Twitter rolled out labeling on their platforms within a few weeks of each other. So Facebook initially was going to roll out their labels back in November, December of 2019, but it kind of hit pause after I think a lot of organizations, including media like Al Jazeera, pushed back on their initial thoughts about how to do this. And they did 6 more months of consultations. They did publish a partial list of who they consulted with. Again, that included CPJ and myself, as well as several others on this call. And they opted for the term state controlled, which has a lot of baggage that comes with it, and a lot of the several of the news organizations that feared that it would get the label, especially, for example, Al Jazeera, RT, actually objected very forcefully to that label. And nonetheless, they did adopt that terminology. They have a long list of the factors that they say that they look at in terms of making that determination, including editorial independence standards, looking at how, what is publicly available in terms of that information. But the fact is that it is definitely subjective, and there is a team on Facebook that is, doing that assessment, but it is not global and it is not consistently applied, again, to all media. And in fact, one media organization called Mathic, which runs several Facebook and Instagram accounts for media outlets, including In the Now, and an opinion site and an education site, actually filed a lawsuit that claimed that Facebook's designation of its outlets as Russian state-controlled media was inaccurate and defamatory. And so that lawsuit is still ongoing. And interestingly, when I spoke with the director there, the CEO, she wants to find someone who will do an assessment for them and make that determination on their own. So then we saw Twitter roll out a label to its users, but it decided to focus only on users in the the permanent members of the Security Council. So they rolled out the term state-affiliated news media, which is a lot more ambiguous than funding or control. So it gives them a little bit more wiggle room. They rolled that out to the state media that are part and state journalists and some political actors who have a representational role as a spokesperson for that government. And the reason that they focused on those initial countries is because they said they have an outsized impact on the global conversation. And so these were labels that were applied to institutional accounts as well as personal accounts of editors-in-chief and other prominent staff that work for state-affiliated media, which was a different approach than the other two. Now, both Facebook and Twitter also included limitations on amplification and advertising for news organizations that received the label. So that can, of course, potentially impact their visibility, their reach, their ability to monetize content. Although I think a lot of some state media don't advertise much, so it's still unclear what the impact is going to be. One of the big takeaways from the research that I conducted is that we just have no idea what the impact of this is going to be on these media outlets, other than them being very concerned about the rollout of the media labels, because the platforms are not even collecting the data that could potentially be used if they were to share it with researchers or journalists to make that assessment. So I was really shocked that Google, which has had these labels out for about 2 years, is not collecting data about engagement, visitation, anything about perception to allow us to see whether it's having the intended impact. Facebook and Twitter, when I interviewed them, did not have any plans to collect that data either. So that means that these tech platforms are rolling out policies that have the potential to have a serious impact on how users perceive news media, as well as how those news media are able to reach their audience and amplify and monetize their content. But we have no idea what that impact is going to be, and no way to even find it out because no one is collecting that data. Now, RT said that after the Google labels, it didn't see any impact on visitation, and it likes to say that it is one of the most visited sites on social media, et cetera. But then, we're relying on self-reporting by these media outlets, which is problematic in itself. So again, I have a few recommendations included in here, which unsurprisingly also include greater transparency and access to remedy. So I think we'll get into those in the conversation. And I want to wrap up there and turn over to the next chapter, which is by stellar group over at Ranking Digital Rights, including Natalie Marichal, Ellery Roberts-Biddle, Jessica Deere, and Rebecca McKinnon. who drafted a chapter called "It's the Business Model: How Big Tech's Profit Machine is Distorting the Public Sphere and Threatening to Democracy." This is based on a report that Ranking Digital Rights did, but we felt like it was so important to the issues that we're discussing here. We asked that they adapt it for this publication, and we have Ellery Biddle here to discuss the main points of the issues of media sustainability and how the underlying economic model that dominates this digital ecosystem impacts on our ability to understand how targeted advertising and surveillance capitalism works. So Ellery, turning it over to you.
Thank you so much. It's so great to be here and to see old colleagues and meet new ones. I only wish that we were all together in a room somewhere in the world, but one day. That was a great introduction, Courtney. And so I'll just jump right into it. So I would love to share with everyone and encourage you to read these two reports that we did this past spring, in which we took a critical look at the social and human rights implications of what drives profit at Facebook, Twitter, and Google. And this was, although we're a global research organization, this was a US-focused project. But the implications and sort of everything I'm going to talk about here are completely sort of as relevant, if not in some cases, I would argue more so, outside of the United States. So all three of these tech giants have built their business models on targeted advertising and algorithmic systems that can determine the reach of a message by targeting users who are most likely to share it. And as we all know, this can thus influence the viewpoints of thousands or even millions of people. And this group here, I'm so grateful, has surfaced ample evidence of how these dynamics have dire consequences for civil society, for media, human rights, democracy, and public health. And as we put some energy into the particular point that in a situation of a pandemic, disinformation about health can literally mean life or death. So in this series, we argue that the big tech companies need to be held responsible, not necessarily for the content that appears on their platforms, but for the underlying systems that amplify and drive that content and the policies that govern the creation of those systems. We recommend policy measures that will protect freedom of expression while holding digital platforms much more accountable for the effects of their business models on public discourse and civil society. So our first report lays out the problems at hand and shows how simply reining in problematic content or trying to develop this seemingly unreachable perfect policy for content is not going to lead to better outcomes for the digital public sphere or for human rights. Using algorithmic systems or artificial intelligence to filter problematic content, it won't solve these problems and it will create others. As our colleagues have shown, there is this sort of endless collateral censorship of really important messages. And on this note, we also, in our paper, urged US policymakers to preserve Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which protects platforms from legal responsibility for content posted by users. Our argument is that instead, companies need to be held accountable for how content is amplified and targeted. What we do know, and what colleagues here like Tanya and Fiona are sort of helping us see, is how content shaping algorithms actually affect what kinds of information people are able to see and access. What is driving these? It's actually profit. Companies show users viral content, serve them ads, and collect more data about them along the way. This in turn helps companies target, or in their words, personalize content and more ads at users in what becomes an endless iterative process. And the targeted advertising systems in general rely on these and other invasive data collection practices to create detailed digital profiles of users. So as we all know, this enables anyone who can buy ads on the platform to target specific groups of people in any number of ways, including with manipulative or misleading messages that can result in unfair and sometimes illegal discrimination. Reliance on revenue from targeted advertising incentivizes companies, in turn, to design platforms that are addictive, that manufacture virality, and that maximize the information that a company can collect about its users. Our data shows that companies are unacceptably opaque about how these systems work, as well as about how political actors are using these systems. And as many of my fellow panelists have made clear, this lack of transparency makes it impossible to have an informed discussion about solutions and about how best to regulate this industry. So our bigger call here is actually for government regulation in the US, but we still built in some recommendations for companies. So we urge them to undertake corporate due diligence on the impact of these systems, to set and enforce rules to prevent malicious manipulation of these systems, and to institute transparency practices that will allow users to understand who is influencing what kind of content they see online and why they are the people seeing it. So on the question of regulation, we think that we can drastically reduce the power of harmful content if we focus on regulating companies' underlying data-driven and money-making technological systems. So we argue that policymakers should adopt an international human rights framework for holding the companies accountable. And while we were, again, focusing on the big companies in the US, such a framework could be as applicable in many other jurisdictions. Part of our emphasis here, of course, is that using international human rights standards can allow lawmakers to determine how best to regulate these companies while prioritizing users' rights to privacy and free speech. So we proposed a few concrete areas where we would like the US Congress to act to mitigate some of these harms. The first is transparency and accountability for all types of online advertising, akin to requirements that we have in the US but currently only apply to print and broadcast political ads. We argue that those kinds of requirements should just be due to the kind of impossibility of defining what is a political ad these days, is to just apply those standards to all ads. The second thing that we are proposing is a federal privacy law that would protect people from the harmful impacts of this type of data collection that fuels this whole dynamic. And lastly, we're pushing for corporate governance reform that would require companies to disclose information pertaining to the social and human rights impacts of these systems. The kind of where we put our most kind of work and emphasis here is on passing a strong data privacy law. If this were to happen, and if it were effectively enforced, this could really make a big difference in the degree to which internet users are protected from the types of discrimination inherent in automated content optimization, and could also go a long way to limit the viral spread of harmful messages. Communities around the world are paying the price for companies' failures to make credible efforts to understand and track their social impact, as is so clear from this group, and to take responsibility for preventing and mitigating social harms that their business can cause or contribute to. It is time to adjust course and design a resilient and equitable information environment that protects human rights and civil liberties, especially in times of crisis and change like these.
Great. Thank you so much, Ellery. I think that's a really important summary, and we'll delve into some more of the recommendations. I think, again, we're seeing some definite themes here. And as your chapter focuses on some recommendations for how US policymakers might think about regulating platforms which are based, largely based in the country that they have jurisdiction over, I want to turn now to the EU, because the EU is also looking at how to regulate these platforms, which, though not necessarily based there, though they certainly have operations there, nonetheless have, of course, a huge impact on their media ecosystems. So I want to turn now to Olaf Stenfat from Reporters Without Borders, who wrote a chapter called Sustaining Journalism During COVID-19, How the EU Can Turn Digital Platform Regulation into a Tool for Democracy. And this is based on a report that he did over the summer as well. And Olaf is looking at how the social media has altered our information ecosystem so that any, discussion about regulating tech companies needs to include a discussion about the role of journalism and press freedom, and looking specifically at the European Commission's plans for the Digital Services Act and how that could actually be used to foster media sustainability. So I want to turn now to Olaf, and if you can give us a bit of an overview of your chapter, that would be great. Thank you.
Yes, hello everyone. Thank you so much for having me, and hello from a home office near Frankfurt in Germany. Allow me to thank also the German Friedrich Ebert Foundation that sponsored this particular paper, and of course Reporters Without Borders for providing the whole framework of this activity. I think as a point of departure, we look at the whole situation currently as a big window of opportunity in many ways. As it was said before, definitely the COVID situation provides, I think, a bit of a reckoning for all of us in many ways, particularly also at policy levels where currently I think trustworthy information is revalued again because it can literally save lives, as it was mentioned earlier. And at the same time, quite cynically, it pushes media outlets and operations further to the cliff edge economically as well. But at the same time, at this moment in time, we see the Digital Services Act materializing, which will become, one way or the other, a quite significant piece of platform regulation, not only at the European level, but also for member states. And in the inception of the Digital Services Act, we also see, I think, a new platform and understanding of multilateralism in this particular field, particularly involving, I would call them middle powers. So countries like Canada, Australia, Japan, and some of the EU member states looking at these issues with much more priority. When we speak about legislative or policy approaches, I think the trigger term is always market failure. And obviously, I think everybody would agree that we look at, I think, a range of different market failures along the value chain in the digital economy. And this also, interestingly, and maybe also promising, coincides with the mandate of the European Commission in the field of competition. So this is, I think, very important to keep in mind when we speak about approaches and solution. And when we speak about antitrust, competition, and trade relevant, I would say, points here or approaches, in the end, it will come to one way or the other, it will come to redistribution mechanisms. And of course, also concentration or measures against concentration, market concentration as well. And as this will happen anyway, we were asking ourselves how we can help to get it right, or at least not totally wrong. What we see in policy circles happening already, particularly at the level of member states and national governments, is always a reflex to chase the bad online, which then produces solutions like the infamous German Netzwerkdurchsetzungsgesetz. I will not even try to translate this term, with a lot of caveats. And at RSF, we see this quite critically and with lots of I think, evidence that this is also limiting freedom of speech and human rights in some cases, particularly if this way of thinking is enforced in other places. And for that reason, we really believe it is at least equally important to support the good online. And if you want to do this, of course, you need, first of all, a definition what the good is, and then move forward to more, I mean, the legal technical term is due prominence logic and even regulation in this field. Interestingly, this way of thinking, particularly on the end of the European Commission, but also member states, does have a legacy. If you think of traditional must-carry rules in broadcasting, which would oblige, for example, cable operators or EPGs to carry, for example, public service media or local media prominently. Another example of due prominence is a stipulation for, or a quota for, European works in the Audiovisual Media Services Directive. So this kind of affirmative action, if you wish, in legal terms has already, you know, a legacy. And I think the task right now and the challenge is to translate must carry into must be found kind of thinking in the digital world and how to do it technically. What we are proposing and what we believe is a kind of condition to get this going, first of all, is to have a unified list of criteria, what we mean by the good. And obviously, this is not so much looking on individual pieces of content, because we would believe this is a terrible idea to try and rank and rate and judge content, because it can easily be misused and turned into censorship, but rather look at the process level, the manufacturing level of journalism. And this is what we've tried to propose and publish actually as a European standard called the Journalism Trust Initiative late last year. So that exists already. The second point on the list is to not only publish another professional norm, because an abundance of professional norms exist already, but to add an additional level of compliance. And as a journalist, I might say that when I speak about reckoning, that the whole situation we face is also a deep look into the mirror right now. And as we all know, a look into the mirror is not always pleasant. So the main question, the underlying question here is, do we stick as a journalistic community to our own norms, and what happens if we don't? So this is what we mean by a compliance mechanism tied to unified criteria. The third requirement would be to turn these criteria and also the certification or the compliance level into machine-readable signals, which then can inform both algorithmic and human decision-making and indexation of content. And the fourth, and then I'm coming back to net governance and legislation. The fourth, let's say, requirement would be legal obligations for platforms to make use of these instruments. And this is basically what we are currently proposing, particularly with a view on a co-regulatory approach, which I think is a European specialty. I mean, EU policy instruments exist already to describe what we mean by co-regulation. And that, and I'm not a lawyer or a legal expert, but in very broad strokes means that you have a shell, an outer shell of hard law and legal obligation, and then an inner core of self-regulatory standards. So to borrow an example from another industry, you would have a law that tells you that cars must be safe, but no law in the world would explain or tell you what a safe car looks like, because then you have industry standards that would actually deliver or provide the technical specs. Also because technology changes all the time and you don't want to change the law all the time. So the law references technical standards. And if, as a manufacturer, you stick to these standards and you're in compliance with this and you can prove it and you get audited, you are automatically also basically in line with the legal obligation. And if you choose not to, and industry standards are always voluntary, then your liability is automatically much higher. So this is in a nutshell how this co-regulatory logic works, and this is what we try to translate into the field of journalism, and particularly also with the view on sustainability, because interestingly, we got quite positive, I think, promising feedback and a level of collaboration with the advertising sector, which also, I think, shows a quite significant demand of these types of signals. They call it brand safety, which basically means to identify safe environments online. And if we can manage to tie ad spend to compliance with professional norms in journalism, we believe it can essentially help to remonetize trustworthy sources. And this is kind of the not only the logic and policy, but also the, I would say, functionality and technical infrastructure we would like to propose and implement. And I think I leave it here. I'm sure there are lots of questions about this. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Olaf. I think there is definitely a lot to dig in there, and interested to kind of get this into conversation also with thinking about how we could bring together an approach that would cross the Atlantic. But before we do that, I want to turn to our last but not least chapter. And I also want to ask people to get ready for your questions, put them into the chat, raise some of the issues. We're going to have about 15 minutes after the final presentation, maybe 20, depending on Michael and Mira. So get ready, put that stuff in the chat. But now let me turn to Michael Ogia and Mira Milosevic, who are with the Global Forum on Media Development, which also acts as a secretariat for this dynamic coalition. And we definitely could not make this work without Michael, who is incredible with organization and keeping us on top of where we need to be. So just a little thank you from me and the other co-coordinators and the whole dynamic coalition. You guys wrote the final concluding chapter on threats to media sustainability and freedom of expression in the digital age, really taking a global look at some of the major issues facing journalism today, the pathways for addressing some of the core issues with financial sustainability, economic viability in the digital age, and arguing for a wider and more robust legislative conversation on the digital economy, which sounds like it builds right on with what we're hearing from Ellery and Olaf. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Michael.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction, Courtney. And honestly, it's been such a pleasure working with you, Dan and Hesben, as well. I mean, it's great to see how this was just an idea that came about at IGF 2017. And here we are, it's launched, it has co-coordinators, excellent ones at that. And we're now about to launch our first annual report. I mean, this is the culmination of essentially of a dream of ours, which was to make this happen. So thank you, and obviously to everybody who made this possible. Indeed, I really am not going to speak long, because I think the chapter, I almost want it to stand as almost like a reference for the community going forward. It's a bit of a departure from the rest of the case studies and the analyses featured, as it takes a bit of a broader and maybe holistic, but also more of a kind of laying out the lay of the land kind of approach to this topic. But that's specifically to understanding how media sustainability and freedom of expression are closely interconnected. If you can take one thing away from my intervention, it should be this. And I personally really love this axiom that has been developed. It's not my axiom. I'm pretty sure it may have come from Joyce Barnathan from the International Center for Journalists, but I'm pretty sure I heard her or someone else saying this, but it basically, there is no press freedom without the press, or you cannot have press freedom without the press. And in other words, it's almost irrelevant if we have strong protections for press freedom if the press and journalism and news media in general cannot sustain themselves in the current market environment that exists around the world, or even nonprofit media are not able to sustain themselves. So I really just want to be as brief as I can be and just highlight a couple key points. And that is basically over just 2 decades, changes in the political, technological, social, and business environment have compromised sustainability and thus the independence of journalism and news media globally. And on top of that, the ability for journalists and news media to even survive, much less thrive. With COVID-19 especially, amplifying the crisis, the coming years will be decisive for the future of journalism. And one of the main pillars for financial stability for many newsrooms, advertising revenue, is fast disappearing. So what we created, it goes a little bit into this, what we wrote rather, it goes a little bit into this problem, exploring not just advertising revenue business models, which Ellery and Olaf go way more into detail with, but we give a bit of an overview as to some of those threats: media consolidation, media capture, obviously, and then there are certain things that we don't necessarily mention by name, but we essentially are referring to or we are alluding to. Things like SLAPs, strategic litigation against public participation. Something like SLAPs are now being used in a way to not just silence journalists, but essentially force or bring resources that could be used for investigative journalism to now face long drawn out court procedures. That undermines not just press freedom, but also sustainability of journalism. Something like right to be forgotten, something very close to my heart, something that I've worked very closely with Dan on. We are now seeing how right to be forgotten cases are being used against journalists in Europe especially, as essentially the same way that SLAPs are being used against journalists. So, I mean, there's already been closures because there just is not the ability for news organizations to sustain themselves when, especially going up against people that are very well financed and very well have many lawyers on their team. The point of this is these are just examples of how freedom of expression issues and media sustainability issues, and obviously within the context of press freedom, go hand in hand. We cannot separate one from the other because they're really interconnected. So with that said, there's a lot more that I could be saying, but I think that's a good place to leave it for now. I just want to thank everybody once again for making this possible, and I look forward to the discussion.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Michael. I mean, I think the fact that you pointed out the right to be forgotten, which was really seen as, regulating search results, but as you said, has been kind of weaponized against journalists and media outlets. There was a really interesting case in Italy where a media outlet ended up shutting down because it could not comply, and local authorities interpreting the so-called right to be forgotten to then mean that it's, the source, the journalistic sources are not then able to keep their articles up. So, lots to dig into here. Again, I want to invite people to stick a message in the chat if you'd like to ask your question by having me point to you and you want to just say it out loud. Again, put that in the chat. So while we wait for people to engage, I want to bring together a couple of things we heard here. So the Journalism Trust Initiative, the idea of labels on media and political ads, this idea of a comprehensive ad database, kind of all these aspects that could increase transparency. One of the things that stands out to me in these chapters is that there really is a challenge with national level remedies because they're unlikely to be effective, and we really need to look at something that is broader because of the global scope of the technology platforms and of course the internet. And so I want to turn to, I think, Tanya and Fiona to get some thoughts about what you heard from some of the in the centers of power that are regulating, that have the power to regulate and impose regulations and legal frameworks on the tech platforms, so the US and the EU, if we think about this co-regulatory approach, if we think about increased, efforts to increase transparency like this and using existing instruments, do you think that will have an impact in improving the situation on the ground for the type of media outlets that you guys are working with and the issues that you're seeing with content removal? And let me turn first to Tanya and then to Fiona, just to get kind of your reactions to some of these more macro level approaches.
Well, thank you for your question. Yeah, it's a bit tricky to say yes, the co-regulation will be the remedy for it all. But I think that some sort of regulation and some sort of policy dialogue really needs to kick off, because somehow we are in the shadow of all these processes that are launched at the EU level, as Olaf explained well, and the US, as Ellery explained a little bit earlier. So we are really open to all discussions that could somehow see us as an actor. If there are no regulatory mechanisms that are now that could be put in place and that could be effective, let's try a different approach. Let's try increasing our own transparency and our self-industrial regulatory mechanisms that Olaf explained, and let's try to negotiate with the platforms to take a little bit more responsibility on their own side. So I'm not expecting that this co-regulation is going to be panacea and can cure everything, but I think that's one step towards the some sort of solution.
And Fiona, I mean, at least, the Balkans is part of the EU, but, RNW Media is working in countries perhaps with the exception of India, which has, I think, probably more influence than some of the other countries where you guys work, like Mexico, Kenya, Nigeria, Egypt. What do you see, especially that these countries do not typically have a place at the table in a lot of these conversations over how to regulate, co-regulate, et cetera?
Then I would say the first thing is also give these countries a place at the table, just for us to also have a better understanding of what is expected of us when we use such platforms. As I mentioned before, each region has its own reasons as to why its ads are being rejected or why its content is not being pushed as much. So just having that better understanding by having also a chance to explain ourselves and say, this is what we see fit for our country context. And if that level of transparency is also maintained or increased, then even for us within the countries, we would know this is good for us to post or adjust our content in a way that would not violate these policies, and at the same time be able to provide this information to our target audience.
Great, thank you. It seems like a lot of the cases that both of you raised would be really interesting ones to take to the Facebook Oversight Board. I want to turn to Rachel from UNESCO, who has Rachel Pollack, who wants to ask a question. Please go ahead, Rachel.
Hello, hi everyone. Nice to see you, some familiar faces. I think I was there at the meeting in 2017 at the pre-event, Mira also and Daniel, and we talked about it. So really fantastic to see that it's come together. And Courtney is always a former colleague who is just brilliant in everywhere that I've seen her. So I have a few questions. First, to say overall, I think this topic is so relevant and I think is getting more and more attention, and also within UNESCO. It's something within the work on freedom of expression, media development, press freedom. We're really starting to look more at media sustainability And that's going to be one of the main areas of focus of World Press Freedom Day 2021. Hopefully there will be some aspect of that in person by next spring. Also a report, which again, Courtney is very familiar with, on trends in freedom of expression and media development. So we're planning to have a focus actually on the idea of journalism as a public good and information as a public good. So I think we can continue the conversations bilaterally with all of you, and you'd have a lot of interesting contributions to make, and also that we'll do some consultations and knowledge exchanges. So I hope you can be part of that. In terms of questions, I probably only have time for one. Maybe I'll throw out about 3 or 4 and you can decide which one you have time to answer. I would say looking at the last year, it seems that there actually have been a lot of developments in this area of business models and the platforms. So I'm thinking first of the hate for profit movement that it seems like a long time ago now, but in June and July against police violence and racism and the role of some of these platforms. So I wonder what you think the impact of that was or could be of this kind of civil society mobilization. And then now ongoing the discussions about antitrust violations and the practices of various platforms and whether they may be regulated in new ways, but there's the side of the antitrust as well as liability for content and Section 230. So again, what impact do you think that might have? So civil society or regulation on the basis of anti-competitiveness. On the issue of targeted advertising, I read that the European Parliament had voted to ban or move towards banning targeted advertising, and then that will also be addressed in the Digital Services Act. So I don't know your thoughts about how likely that might be to pass, and again, what impact that would have. And then finally, and as I said, answer any or all of the above on transparency. And there are many different forms of transparency or aspects of transparency that we could talk about. And some of them have been mentioned, of transparency around advertising, kind of algorithmic transparency in what data has been removed. So what sort of forms of transparency do you think are the most important for these issues and also the most feasible and actually getting change in the near future? So thank you.
Thank you so much, Rachel. I want to first go to Olaf to maybe give us some thoughts about the advertising side, as well as, we have a question in the chat from Gilles Demptos about what we would have to do to convince large advertisers to show more responsibility in their ad spending, and whether imposing more transparency in the digital ad ecosystem is a necessary prerequisite. And then I want to go to Fiona, because your chapter specifically looked at ads. So Olaf, why don't you take a first stab at answering Rachel's first or second question?
Yes, sure, with pleasure. I think what you're referring to with European Parliament, I think they have not voted on a law, but just passed an initiative report, which will then feed into the Digital Services Act draft and discussion. On targeted advertising, I can only give you my kind of personal take. I think this is obviously the business model of large parts of the internet, and taking this away just so might have a lot of unintentional consequences. So I think the targeting is probably not so much the problem, but intransparency and false or kind of misleading incentives. So I think the task is more to reverse the logic of incentives in targeting and you can also say personalizing the internet rather than just abolishing it at large. The antitrust discussion, I think, is also an interesting one, because just reflecting from what I hear, it might be easier to rein in just Facebook rather than having 10 Facebooks and a race to the bottom of lowering actually standards and dealing with them in maybe a more open market. So just basically splitting up these platforms might not ultimately be the best solution. But if we speak about disentangling different services, and this is usually the case when antitrust is concerned, I think also in the US. So when, for example, shops and other services that Google provides are integrated and treated preferentially in search, this is an antitrust issue, not so much like having 6 search engines at hand as a consumer. On the, yes?
Let me just go to Fiona on the issue of the advertising, and because I could see how something like Stop for Hate, if advertisers say we don't want our content to show up next to sex or anything to do with love or sexual reproduction, etc. Is there the risk of an unintended consequence? What are your thoughts about this approach to kind of advertising and the power, what the issues that Rachel raised in her question?
So I think in line to the issue that was raised about transparency, I'd say that like Facebook would be clear, like we don't want to see words such as sex. And we make sure that even when we put up such content, we make sure that we don't violate such policies, so that we make sure like our ads are approved and we are able to like share the much needed information. But unfortunately, even as much as we try to censor our content, and it's not that our content is completely explicit, but every time we try to even censor our content, it still gets disapproved for some reason. So the one thing we're asking, or one thing we're hoping to see improve in the future, is just the making sure that the policies are sufficient and clear enough. I feel like they're a bit vague. And again, region-based, region-focused, something that would initially benefit my region would ideally be different from some other region, but again, for Facebook to make that clear. And again, in regards to that need for transparency, I'd say the most burning issue for me, working a lot with Facebook ads, is just figuring out how much human content moderation is used while determining which ads are valid and which ones aren't. So we have no idea whether it's just ads that pass through algorithms, of which, again, not like our content would not fit a certain algorithm and again be disapproved. But again, just also trying to understand what's the process of an ad being disapproved would be very helpful for us shaping our work. Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Fiona. I know there's a lot more in Rachel's questions, but I also would encourage people to read the report when it's out. I think there are some potential responses to that. And I do want to get to some of the other questions in the chat. There's kind of two related one. One is, what can journalists do in respect to trying to push back on some of this? And what role might like NGOs and media sustainability, the nonprofit international development entities that support independent media worldwide, what role can they play in supporting this movement? That question comes from Lauren Javis. And just the consideration of whether, are there alternative platforms that journalists, activists, and frontliners need, and this is coming from Esther Mwema, are there other existing platforms for a critical mass? So I want to open this up, and I'm going to ask the panelists to just, maybe I'll go to Ellery to get your thoughts on that, as an NGO yourself, and if you want to provide some input on that.
Sure, yeah. So, and I work with Ranking Digital Rights now, but for a number of years before, I was the advocacy director at Global Voices, which many of you know, big international decentralized media organization, where we were encountering these kind of issues, both in a variety of ways. The kinds of cases that Fiona and Tanya have raised, we're writing about, but then also as a media organization, we're always struggling to keep up with the rules and the changes in algorithms so that we could make sure people could see our stories. And I just think that it is so important for journalists to report on exactly the kinds of issues that you two are raising, because and to find shrewd, strategic ways to do that reporting when it can be loud and heard by powerful actors. Like, I think that the example of Myanmar is one of many. It's huge and has particularly horrifying characteristics, but the fact that in the Congress in the US, there was a moment in these hearings where suddenly everybody knew about this role that Facebook had played in a genocide that's serious impact that was achieved because of journalists and activists in the country working together and making sure that this message was received. And so I can't stress enough how important I think that kind of pressure is, because the companies, I don't know what's going to happen with regulation, but they hate bad PR. They hate to look that bad, and it is sometimes up to journalists to find the way to put on the pressure publicly.
Thank you, Ellery. I want to turn to Mira to address the issue that was just raised, as well as if you wanted to jump in on the advertising question that Rachel had asked. I just saw your response. Please go ahead.
I would thank you, Courtney, and thanks to everyone for joining today. I didn't want to speak much, but just to follow up also on Lauren's question, what international organizations can do, and then reflect on advertising as well. One of our great achievements as international nonprofit community that works in this area is to establish this dynamic coalition. And together we have created many conversations that had fed into very important policy discussions over the last couple of years. So for instance, Olaf has been involved together with Ranking Digital Rights and also CPJ in Europe with coordinating among ourselves responses to Digital Services Act that is being prepared at the moment. There was also a very significant contribution on the question of advertising transparency, and we have all signed a powerful submission calling for universal ad transparency. So this dynamic coalition has actually contributed to that, and we feel that there are so many other conversations that we are having at the moment where groups like this, and also having information from all around the world, including Kenya and Balkans, is allowing us to feed a better quality information into these discussions. On the advertising transparency and hate for profit and advertisers, unfortunately, the brands have been named and shamed, and went to the other direction by blacklisting a lot of content that they consider could be tricky to be next to. And so World Federation of Advertisers, in cooperation with big platforms, has created some kind of a safety brand guidance that actually included a lot of journalism as a risky category. And so there are so many fights and hills that we need to climb in this conversation. So just to kind of cut this long story short, in the future, we have two asks as a secretariat of this dynamic coalition from all of you. First is to let us know how we can also make all these conversations more inclusive. So what are the ways and channels, except from Zoom meetings, where we can bring more of the voices from around the world into all the policy conversations? And the second ask is for all of you to send us contacts of organizations and experts in your countries and your regions that are involved with informing also national policy conversations, so that we can have more exchange of best practices and ideas. So that's so much for me. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Mira. And I know we are coming up on the end of our time, and there are other questions, including one about the Facebook Oversight Board, but I would note that as we were writing this chapter, it had not yet become operational, but I have very little doubt that many of us will be discussing about how we are going to leverage that new entity. So unfortunately, we are out of time. I want to thank everyone for a really interesting discussion. I think we could go on much longer. And with that, I guess I'd like to ask Hesbin, our third co-coordinator, if you'd like to just say a couple of concluding remarks. I know he's also okay, go ahead, Hesbin.
Thank you very much, Courtney, all the participants and the panelists. I think this is a great experience just to join in and listen to the names behind the reports. It's been great working with Michael and Daniel and Courtney. I must say that I've been more of a quasi-member of this group, still learning a lot about IGF and the dynamic coalition. But it's great to meet all of you. It would have been much greater if we had met in Poland. But as they say, mediated technology is a good thing because we can easily meet even in this very interesting time of the COVID pandemic. We're looking forward to interacting with the document more and sharing this conversation in different platforms. And all I can say right now is thanks to all of you, and probably take it back to Courtney.
Great. Well, yeah, thank you. Apologies, there's some construction in the apartment behind me, so if you hear something, I'm fine. But yeah, we're going to have to wrap up. I just want to thank a couple people. I want to especially thank the Global Forum for Media Development for being our secretariat, Mira and Michael in particular, along with their assistants. I also want to thank our captioner and our technical assistants from the IGF who are with us, who have been helping us make this happen. We can't be there in person, and so they're making this work virtually. I also want to offer, because we can't be there virtually, if people are interested and turning on your video, if you want, we can take a really quick screen grab, a picture of us all to show that we were here and that we would have this really engaging discussion about media sustainability. So if you want to, go ahead, fix your hair, turn your camera on, and we'll take a quick screen grab. I also want to just say that, we're planning, this work is going to continue. We'll be reaching out to you as the co-coordinators to hear about what members of our dynamic coalition want to do in the upcoming year. If you want to join our mailing list, visit our website. I'm going to ask Michael if he can put our website back in the chat. So, go there, sign up on our website. You'll be getting an email from us soon as we think about what type of activities we'll be doing next year around IGF. Also, potentially, it sounds like World Press Freedom Day might be an interesting place where we could take some of this information and engage it. And of course, we'll be working on an annual report next year. So if you're identifying new topics that are at the intersection of internet governance and media development, we really encourage you to submit and become part of the conversation. So now I'm going to go ahead and take a couple screen grabs on the count of 3. 1, 2, 3. Okay, and now page 2. 1, 2, 3. Great. I think that we have to make do with what we can. It's really great to do this virtually. We are able to have a lot more participation. It's really great to see your faces and to have you all involved. Thank you very much for attending today.
Thanks, everyone.
Big round of applause to our authors as well. Thank you so much for your contributions. It's a great report. We'll be circulating it very shortly.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you all. Take care.
Bye, everyone. Oh, it's only me and you now. I just wanted to say thank you for being here with me. It was great having you. Rona.
Okay, bye then.
Bye.